Arthur Neville Chamberlain was a British politician of the Conservative Party who served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from May 1937 to May 1940. He is best known for his foreign policy of appeasement, and in particular for his signing of the Munich Agreement on September 30, 1938, ceding the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany led by Adolf Hitler. Following the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, which marked the beginning of the Second World War, Chamberlain announced the declaration of war on Germany 2 days later and led the United Kingdom through the first 8 months of the war until his resignation as Prime Minister on May 10, 1940. After working in business and local government, and after a short spell as Director of National Service in 1916 and 1917, Chamberlain followed his father Joseph Chamberlain and elder half-brother Austen Chamberlain in becoming a Member of Parliament in the 1918 general election for the new Birmingham Ladywood division at the age of 49. He declined a junior ministerial position, remaining a backbencher until 1922. He was rapidly promoted in 1923 to Minister of Health and then Chancellor of the Exchequer. After a short-lived Labour-led government, he returned as Minister of Health, introducing a range of reform measures from 1924 to 1929. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer in the national government in 1931. Chamberlain succeeded Stanley Baldwin as Prime Minister on May 28, 1937. His premiership was dominated by the question of policy towards an increasingly aggressive Germany, and his actions at Munich were widely popular among the British at the time. In response to Hitler's continued aggression, Chamberlain pledged the United Kingdom to defend Poland's independence if the latter were attacked, an alliance that brought his country into war after the German invasion of Poland. The failure of Allied forces to prevent the German invasion of Norway caused the House of Commons to hold the historic Norway debate in May 1940. Chamberlain's conduct of the war was heavily criticized by members of all parties and, in a vote of confidence, his government's majority was greatly reduced. Accepting that a national government supported by all the main parties was essential, Chamberlain resigned the premiership because the Labour and Liberal parties would not serve under his leadership. Although he still led the Conservative Party, he was succeeded as Prime Minister by his colleague Winston Churchill. Until ill health forced him to resign on September 22, 1940, Chamberlain was an important member of the War Cabinet as Lord President of the Council, heading the government in Churchill's absence. Chamberlain died aged 71 on November 9, 1940 of cancer, 6 months after leaving the premiership. Chamberlain's reputation remains controversial among historians, the initial high regard for him being entirely eroded by books such as Guilty Men, published in July 1940, which blamed Chamberlain and his associates for the Munich Accord and for allegedly failing to prepare the country for war. Most historians in the generation following Chamberlain's death held similar views, led by Churchill in The Gathering Storm. Some later historians have taken a more favorable perspective of Chamberlain and his policies, citing government papers released under the 30-Year Rule and arguing that going to war with Germany in 1938 would have been disastrous as the UK was unprepared. Nonetheless, Chamberlain is still unfavorably ranked amongst British prime ministers. Early life and political career. Childhood and businessman. Chamberlain was born on March 18, 1869 in a house called Southbourne in the Edgbaston district of Birmingham. He was the only son of the second marriage of Joseph Chamberlain, who later became mayor of Birmingham and a cabinet minister. His mother was Florence Kenrick, a cousin of William Kenrick MP. She died when he was a small boy. Joseph Chamberlain had had another son, Austen Chamberlain, by his first marriage. The Chamberlain family were Unitarian, though Joseph lost personal religious faith by the time Neville was 6 years old and never required religious adherence of his children. Neville, who disliked attending worship services of any kind and showed no interest in organized religion, described himself as a Unitarian with no stated faith and also a reverent agnostic. Neville Chamberlain was educated at home by his elder sister Beatrice Chamberlain and later at Rugby School. Joseph Chamberlain then sent Neville to Mason College, now University of Birmingham. Neville Chamberlain had little interest in his studies there, and in 1889 his father apprenticed him to a firm of accountants. Within 6 months he became a salaried employee. In an effort to recoup diminished family fortunes, Joseph Chamberlain sent his younger son to establish a sisal plantation on Andros Island in the Bahamas. Neville Chamberlain spent 6 years there, but the plantation was a failure, and Joseph Chamberlain lost £50,000. On his return to England, Neville Chamberlain entered business, purchasing Hoskins and Company, a manufacturer of metal ship berths. Chamberlain served as managing director of Hoskins for 17 years, during which time the company prospered. He also involved himself in civic activities in Birmingham. In 1906, as governor of Birmingham General Hospital, and along with no more than 15 other dignitaries, Chamberlain became a founding member of the National United Hospitals Committee of the British Medical Association. At 40, Chamberlain was expecting to remain a bachelor, but in 1910 he fell in love with Anne Cole, a recent connection by marriage, and married her the following year. They met through his Aunt Lillian, the Canadian-born widow of Joseph Chamberlain's brother Herbert, who in 1907 had married Anne Cole's uncle Alfred Clayton Cole, a director of the Bank of England. She encouraged and supported his entry into local politics and was to be his constant companion, helper, and trusted colleague, fully sharing his interests in housing and other political and social activities after his election as an MP. The couple had a son and a daughter. Entry into politics. Chamberlain initially showed little interest in politics, though his father and half-brother were in Parliament. During the Cocky election of 1900 he made speeches in support of Joseph Chamberlain's Liberal Unionists. The Liberal Unionists were allied with the Conservatives and later merged with them under the name Unionist Party, which in 1925 became known as the Conservative and Unionist Party. In 1911, Neville Chamberlain successfully stood as a Liberal Unionist for Birmingham City Council for the All Saints ward, located within his father's parliamentary constituency. Chamberlain was made chairman of the Town Planning Committee. Under his direction, Birmingham soon adopted one of the first town planning schemes in Britain. The start of the First World War in 1914 prevented implementation of his plans. In 1915, Chamberlain became Lord Mayor of Birmingham. Apart from his father Joseph, 5 of Chamberlain's uncles had also attained the chief Birmingham civic dignity. They were Joseph's brother Richard Chamberlain, William and George Kenrick, Charles Bale, who had been 4 times Lord Mayor, and Sir Thomas Martineau. As a Lord Mayor in wartime, Chamberlain had a huge burden of work, and he insisted that his councillors and officials work equally hard. He halved the Lord Mayor's expense allowance and cut back on the number of civic functions expected of the incumbent. In 1915, Chamberlain was appointed a member of the Central Control Board on Liquor Traffic. In December 1916, Prime Minister David Lloyd George offered Chamberlain the new position of Director of National Service, with responsibility for coordinating conscription and ensuring that essential war industries were able to function with sufficient workforces. His tenure was marked by conflict with Lloyd George. In August 1917, having received little support from the Prime Minister, Chamberlain resigned. The relationship between Chamberlain and Lloyd George would, thereafter, be one of mutual hatred. Chamberlain decided to stand for the House of Commons, and was adopted as Unionist candidate for Birmingham Ladywood. After the war ended, a general election was called almost immediately. The campaign in this constituency was notable because his Liberal Party opponent was Marjorie Corbett Ashby, one of the 17 women who stood for Parliament at the first election at which women were eligible to do so. Chamberlain reacted to this intervention by being one of the few male candidates to specifically target women voters, deploying his wife, issuing a special leaflet headed "A Word to the Ladies" and holding 2 meetings in the afternoon. Chamberlain was elected with almost 70% of the vote and a majority of 6,833. He was 49 years old, which remains to date the greatest age at which any future Prime Minister has first been elected to the Commons. MP and Minister. Rise from the backbench. Chamberlain threw himself into parliamentary work, begrudging the times when he was unable to attend debates and spending much time on committee work. He was chairman of the National Unhealthy Areas Committee and in that role, had visited the slums of London, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, and Cardiff. Consequently, in March 1920, Bonar Law offered him a junior post at the Ministry of Health on behalf of the Prime Minister, but Chamberlain was unwilling to serve under Lloyd George and was offered no further posts during Lloyd George's premiership. When Law resigned as party leader, Austen Chamberlain took his place as head of the Unionists in Parliament. Unionist leaders were willing to fight the 1922 election in coalition with the Lloyd George Liberals, but on October 19, Unionist MPs held a meeting at which they voted to fight the election as a single party. Lloyd George resigned, as did Austen Chamberlain, and Law was recalled from retirement to lead the Unionists as Prime Minister. Many high-ranking Unionists refused to serve under Law to the benefit of Chamberlain, who rose over the course of 10 months from backbencher to Chancellor of the Exchequer. Law initially appointed Chamberlain Postmaster General and Chamberlain was sworn of the Privy Council. When Sir Arthur Griffith Boscawen, the Minister of Health, lost his seat in the 1922 election and was defeated in a by-election in March 1923 by future Home Secretary James Shuter Ada, Law offered the position to Chamberlain. 2 months later, Law was diagnosed with advanced, terminal throat cancer. He immediately resigned and was replaced by Chancellor of the Exchequer Stanley Baldwin. In August 1923, Baldwin promoted Chamberlain to the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chamberlain served only 5 months in the office before the Conservatives were defeated in the 1923 general election. Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labour Prime Minister, but his government fell within months, necessitating another general election. By a margin of only 77 votes, Chamberlain narrowly defeated the Labour candidate, Oswald Mosley, who later led the British Union of Fascists. Believing he would lose if he stood again in Birmingham Ladywood, Chamberlain arranged to be adopted for Birmingham Edgbaston, the district of the city where he was born and which was a much safer seat, which he would hold for the rest of his life. The Unionists won the election, but Chamberlain declined to serve again as Chancellor, preferring his former position as Minister of Health. Within 2 weeks of his appointment as Minister of Health, Chamberlain presented the Cabinet with an agenda containing 25 pieces of legislation he hoped to see enacted. Before he left office in 1929, 21 of the 25 bills had passed into law. Chamberlain sought the abolition of the elected poor law boards of guardians which administered relief and which in some areas were responsible for rates. Many of the boards were controlled by Labour, and such boards had defied the government by distributing relief funds to the able-bodied unemployed. In 1929, Chamberlain initiated the Local Government Act 1929 to abolish the poor law boards entirely. Chamberlain spoke in the Commons for 2.5 hours on the second reading of the bill, and when he concluded he was applauded by all parties. The bill passed into law. Though Chamberlain struck a conciliatory note during the 1926 general strike, in general he had poor relations with the Labour opposition. Future Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee complained that Chamberlain always treated us like dirt, and in April 1927 Chamberlain wrote, "More and more do I feel an utter contempt for their lamentable stupidity." His poor relations with the Labour Party later played a major part in his downfall as Prime Minister. Opposition and second term as Chancellor. Baldwin called a general election for May 30, 1929, resulting in a hung parliament with Labour holding the most seats. Baldwin and his government resigned and Labour, under MacDonald, again took office. In 1931, the MacDonald government faced a serious crisis as the May report revealed that the budget was unbalanced, with an expected shortfall of £120 million. The Labour government resigned on August 24, and MacDonald formed a national government supported by most Conservative MPs. Chamberlain once again returned to the Ministry of Health. After the 1931 general election, in which supporters of the national government won an overwhelming victory, MacDonald designated Chamberlain as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chamberlain proposed a 10% tariff on foreign goods and lower or no tariffs on goods from the colonies and the Dominions. Joseph Chamberlain had advocated a similar policy, imperial preference. Neville Chamberlain laid his bill before the House of Commons on February 4, 1932, and concluded his address by noting the appropriateness of his seeking to enact his father's proposal. At the end of the speech, Sir Austen Chamberlain walked down from the backbenches and shook his brother's hand. The Import Duties Act 1932 passed Parliament easily. Chamberlain presented his first budget in April 1932. He maintained the severe budget cuts that had been agreed at the inception of the national government. Interest on the war debt was a major cost. Chamberlain reduced the annual interest rate on most of Britain's war debt from 5% to 3.5%. Between 1932 and 1938, Chamberlain halved the percentage of the budget devoted to interest on the war debt. War debt. Welfare spending. Defense spending. Role in the abdication crisis. Premiership. Upon his appointment, Chamberlain considered calling a general election, but with 3.5 years remaining in the current Parliament's term he decided to wait. At 68 he was the second oldest person in the 20th century to become Prime Minister for the first time, and was widely seen as a caretaker who would lead the Conservative Party until the next election and then step down in favour of a younger man, with Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden a likely candidate. From the start of Chamberlain's premiership a number of would-be successors were rumoured to be jockeying for position. Chamberlain had disliked what he considered to be the overly sentimental attitude of both Baldwin and MacDonald on cabinet appointments and reshuffles. Although he had worked closely with the President of the Board of Trade, Walter Runciman, on the tariff issue, Chamberlain dismissed him from his post, instead offering him the token position of Lord Privy Seal, which an angry Runciman declined. Chamberlain thought Runciman, a member of the Liberal National Party, to be lazy. Soon after taking office Chamberlain instructed his ministers to prepare 2-year policy programs. These reports were to be integrated with the intent of coordinating the passage of legislation through the current Parliament, the term of which was to expire in November 1940. At the time of his appointment, Chamberlain's personality was not well known to the public, though he had made annual budget broadcasts for 6 years. According to Chamberlain biographer Robert Self, these appeared relaxed and modern, showing an ability to speak directly to the camera. Chamberlain had few friends among his parliamentary colleagues. An attempt by his parliamentary private secretary, Lord Dunglass, to bring him to the Commons smoking room to socialise with colleagues ended in embarrassing silence. Chamberlain compensated for these shortcomings by devising the most sophisticated press management system employed by a Prime Minister up to that time, with officials at Number 10, led by his Chief of Press George Stewart, convincing members of the press that they were colleagues sharing power and insider knowledge, and should espouse the government line. Domestic policy. Chamberlain saw his elevation to the premiership as the final glory in a career as a domestic reformer, not realizing that he would be remembered for foreign policy decisions. One reason he sought the settlement of European issues was the hope it would allow him to concentrate on domestic affairs. Soon after attaining the premiership, Chamberlain obtained passage of the Factories Act 1937. This act was aimed at bettering working conditions in factories, and placed limits on the working hours of women and children. In 1938, Parliament enacted the Coal Act 1938, which allowed for nationalization of coal deposits. Another major law passed that year was the Holidays with Pay Act 1938. Though the act only recommended that employers give workers a week off with pay, it led to a great expansion of holiday camps and other leisure accommodation for the working classes. The Housing Act 1938 provided subsidies aimed at encouraging slum clearance and maintained rent control. Chamberlain's plans for the reform of local government were shelved because of the outbreak of war in 1939. Likewise, the raising of the school leaving age to 15, scheduled for implementation on September 1, 1939, did not go into effect. Relations with Ireland. Relations between the United Kingdom and the Irish Free State had been strained since the 1932 appointment of Eamon de Valera as President of the Executive Council. The Anglo-Irish trade war, sparked by the withholding of money that Ireland had agreed to pay the United Kingdom, had caused economic losses on both sides, and the two nations were anxious for a settlement. The de Valera government also sought to sever the remaining ties between Ireland and the UK, such as ending the King's status as Irish head of state. As Chancellor, Chamberlain had taken a hardline stance against concessions to the Irish, but as Premier sought a settlement with Ireland, being persuaded that the strained ties were affecting relations with other dominions. Talks had been suspended under Baldwin in 1936 but resumed in November 1937. De Valera sought not only to alter the constitutional status of Ireland, but to overturn other aspects of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, most notably the issue of partition, as well as obtaining full control of the three treaty ports which had remained in British control. Britain, on the other hand, wished to retain the treaty ports, at least in time of war, and to obtain the money that Ireland had agreed to pay. The Irish proved very tough negotiators, so much so that Chamberlain complained that one of de Valera's offers had presented United Kingdom ministers with a three-leafed shamrock, none of the leaves of which had any advantages for the UK. With the talks facing deadlock, Chamberlain made the Irish a final offer in March 1938 which acceded to many Irish positions, though he was confident that he had only given up the small things, and the agreements were signed on April 25, 1938. The issue of partition was not resolved, but the Irish agreed to pay £10 million to the British. There was no provision in the treaties for British access to the treaty ports in time of war, but Chamberlain accepted de Valera's oral assurance that in the event of war the British would have access. Conservative backbencher Winston Churchill attacked the agreements in Parliament for surrendering the treaty ports, which he described as the sentinel towers of the western approaches. When war came, de Valera denied Britain access to the treaty ports under Irish neutrality. Churchill railed against these treaties in the Gathering Storm, stating that he never saw the House of Commons more completely misled and that members were made to feel very differently about it when our existence hung in the balance during the Battle of the Atlantic. Chamberlain believed that the treaty ports were unusable if Ireland was hostile, and deemed their loss worthwhile to assure friendly relations with Dublin. European policy. Early days. Road to Munich. September 1938, Munich. Preliminary meetings. Munich Conference. Aftermath and reception. Path to war. In the aftermath of Munich, Chamberlain continued to pursue a course of cautious rearmament. He told the cabinet in early October 1938, "It would be madness for the country to stop rearming until we were convinced that other countries would act in the same way. For the time being, therefore, we should relax no particle of effort until our deficiencies had been made good." Later in October, he resisted calls to put industry on a war footing, convinced that such an action would show Hitler that Chamberlain had decided to abandon Munich. Chamberlain hoped that the understanding he had signed with Hitler at Munich would lead toward a general settlement of European disputes, but Hitler expressed no public interest in following up on the accord. Having considered a general election immediately following Munich, Chamberlain instead reshuffled his cabinet. By the end of the year, public concerns caused Chamberlain to conclude that to get rid of this uneasy and disgruntled House of Commons by a general election would be suicidal. Despite Hitler's relative quietness as the Reich absorbed the Sudetenland, foreign policy concerns continued to preoccupy Chamberlain. He made trips to Paris and Rome, hoping to persuade the French to hasten their rearmament and Mussolini to be a positive influence on Hitler. Several of his cabinet members, led by Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, began to draw away from the appeasement policy. Halifax was by now convinced that Munich, though better than a European war, had been a horrid business and humiliating. Public revulsion over the pogrom of Kristallnacht on November 9, 1938 made any attempt at a rapprochement with Hitler unacceptable, though Chamberlain did not abandon his hopes. Still hoping for reconciliation with Germany, Chamberlain made a major speech in Birmingham on January 28, 1939, in which he expressed his desire for international peace, and had an advance copy sent to Hitler at Berchtesgaden. Hitler seemed to respond. In his Reichstag speech on January 30, 1939, he stated that he wanted a long peace. Chamberlain was confident that improvements in British defence since Munich would bring the dictator to the bargaining table. This belief was reinforced by a German official's conciliatory speech welcoming Ambassador Henderson back to Berlin after an absence for medical treatment in Britain. Chamberlain responded with a speech in Blackburn on February 22, hoping that the nations would resolve their differences through trade, and was gratified when his comments were printed in German newspapers. With matters appearing to improve, Chamberlain's rule over the House of Commons was firm and he was convinced the government would rump home in a late 1939 election. On March 15, 1939, Germany invaded the Czech provinces of Bohemia and Moravia, including Prague. Though Chamberlain's initial parliamentary response was, according to biographer Nick Smart, feeble, within 48 hours he had spoken more forcefully against the German aggression. In another Birmingham speech, on March 17, Chamberlain warned that Hitler was attempting to dominate the world by force and that no greater mistake could be made than to suppose that because it believes war to be a senseless and cruel thing the nation has so lost its fibre that it will not take part to the utmost of its power in resisting such a challenge if it were ever made. The Prime Minister questioned whether the invasion of Czechoslovakia was the end of an old adventure, or the beginning of a new, and whether it was a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force. Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald said, whereas the Prime Minister was once a strong advocate of peace, he has now definitely swung around to the war point of view. This speech was met with widespread approval in Britain and recruitment for the armed services increased considerably. Chamberlain set out to build an interlocking series of defence pacts among the remaining European countries as a means of deterring Hitler from war. He sought an agreement among Britain, France, the USSR, and Poland, whereby the first three would go to the assistance of Poland if her independence were threatened, but Polish mistrust of the Soviet Union caused those negotiations to fail. Instead, on March 31, 1939, Chamberlain informed an approving House of Commons of British and French guarantees that they would lend Poland all possible aid in the event of any action which threatened Polish independence. In the ensuing debate, Eden stated that the nation was now united behind the government. Even Churchill and Lloyd George praised Chamberlain's government for issuing the guarantee to Poland. The Prime Minister took other steps to deter Hitler from aggression. He doubled the size of the territorial army, created a Ministry of Supply to expedite the provision of equipment to the armed forces, and instituted peacetime conscription. The Italian invasion of Albania on April 7, 1939 led to guarantees being given to Greece and Romania. On June 17, 1939, Handley Page received an order for 200 Hampton twin-engined medium bombers, and by September 3, 1939, the chain of radar stations girding the British coast was fully operational. Chamberlain was reluctant to seek a military alliance with the Soviet Union. He distrusted Joseph Stalin ideologically and felt that there was little to gain, given the recent massive purges in the Red Army. Much of his cabinet favored such an alliance, and when Poland withdrew her objection to an Anglo-Soviet alliance, Chamberlain had little choice but to proceed. The talks with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, to which Britain sent only a low-level delegation, dragged on over several months and eventually foundered on August 14, 1939, when Poland and Romania refused to allow Soviet troops to be stationed on their territories. A week after the failure of these talks, the Soviet Union and Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, committing the countries to non-aggression toward each other. A secret agreement divided up Poland in the event of war. Chamberlain had disregarded rumors of a Soviet-German rapprochement and was dismissive of the publicly announced pact, stating that it in no way affected British obligations toward Poland. On August 23, 1939, Chamberlain had Henderson deliver a letter to Hitler telling him that Britain was fully prepared to comply with its obligations to Poland. Hitler instructed his generals to prepare for an invasion of Poland, telling them, "Our enemies are small worms. I saw them at Munich." War leader. Declaration of war. Phony war. Downfall. Lord President of the Council. In a departure from usual practice, Chamberlain did not issue any resignation honours list. With Chamberlain remaining leader of the Conservative Party, and with many MPs still supporting him and distrusting the new Prime Minister, Churchill refrained from any purge of Chamberlain loyalists. Churchill wished Chamberlain to return to the Exchequer, but he declined, convinced that this would lead to difficulties with the Labour Party. Instead, he accepted the post of Lord President of the Council with a seat in the shrunken five-member War Cabinet. When Chamberlain entered the House of Commons on May 13, 1940, for the first time since his resignation, MPs lost their heads, they shouted, they cheered, they waved their order papers, and his reception was a regular ovation. The House received Churchill coolly. Some of his great speeches to the Chamber, such as "We shall fight on the beaches," met with only half-hearted enthusiasm. Chamberlain's fall from power left him deeply depressed, he wrote. Few men can have known such a reversal of fortune in so short a time. He especially regretted the loss of Chequers as a place where I have been so happy, though after a farewell visit there by the Chamberlains on June 19, he wrote, "I am content now that I have done that, and shall put Chequers out of my mind." As Lord President, Chamberlain assumed vast responsibilities over domestic issues and chaired the War Cabinet during Churchill's many absences. Attlee later remembered him as free from any of the rancour he might have felt against us. He worked very hard and well, a good chairman, a good committeeman, always very businesslike. As chairman of the Lord President's Committee, he exerted great influence over the wartime economy. Halifax reported to the War Cabinet on May 26, 1940, with the Low Countries conquered and French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud warning that France might have to sign an armistice, that diplomatic contacts with a still neutral Italy offered the possibility of a negotiated peace. Halifax urged following up and seeing if a worthwhile offer could be obtained. The battle over the course of action within the War Cabinet lasted 3 days. Chamberlain's statement on the final day, that there was unlikely to be an acceptable offer and that the matter should not be pursued at that time, helped persuade the War Cabinet to reject negotiations. Twice in May 1940, Churchill broached the subject of bringing Lloyd George into the government. Each time, Chamberlain indicated that due to their long-time antipathy he would immediately retire if Lloyd George were appointed a minister. Churchill did not appoint Lloyd George, but brought up the subject with Chamberlain again early in June. This time, Chamberlain agreed to Lloyd George's appointment provided Lloyd George gave a personal assurance to put aside the feud. Lloyd George declined to serve in Churchill's government. Chamberlain worked to bring his Conservative Party in line behind Churchill, working with the Chief Whip, David Margesson, to overcome members' suspicions and dislikes of the Prime Minister. On July 4, after the British attack on the French fleet, Churchill entered the chamber to a great cheer from Conservative MPs orchestrated by the two, and the Prime Minister was almost overcome with emotion at the first cheer he had received from his own party's benches since May. Churchill returned the loyalty, refusing to consider Labour and Liberal attempts to expel Chamberlain from the government. When criticisms of Chamberlain appeared in the press, and when Chamberlain learned that Labour intended to use an upcoming secret session of Parliament as a platform to attack him, he told Churchill that he could only defend himself by attacking Labour. The Prime Minister intervened with the Labour Party and the press, and the criticism ceased, according to Chamberlain, like turning off a tap. In July 1940, a polemic titled Guilty Men was released by Cato, a pseudonym for 3 journalists. It attacked the record of the national government, alleging that it had failed to prepare adequately for war. It called for the removal of Chamberlain and other ministers who had allegedly contributed to the British disasters of the early part of the war. The short book sold more than 200,000 copies, many of which were passed from hand to hand, and went into 27 editions in the first few months, despite not being carried by several major bookshops. According to historian David Dutton, its impact upon Chamberlain's reputation, both among the general public and within the academic world, was profound indeed. Chamberlain had long enjoyed excellent health, except for occasional attacks of gout, but by July 1940 he was in almost constant pain. He sought treatment, and later that month entered hospital for surgery. Surgeons discovered that he was suffering from terminal bowel cancer, but they concealed it from him, instead telling him that he would not require further surgery. Chamberlain resumed work in mid-August. He returned to his office on September 9, but renewed pain, compounded by the nighttime bombing of London which forced him to go to an air raid shelter and denied him rest, sapped his energy, and he left London for the last time on September 19, returning to Highfield Park in Heckfield. Chamberlain offered his resignation to Churchill on September 22, 1940. The Prime Minister was initially reluctant to accept, but as both men realised that Chamberlain would never return to work, Churchill finally allowed him to resign. The Prime Minister asked if Chamberlain would accept the highest order of British chivalry, the Order of the Garter, of which his brother had been a member. Chamberlain refused, saying he would prefer to die plain Mr. Chamberlain like my father before me, unadorned by any title. In the short time remaining to him, Chamberlain was angered by the short, cold, and for the most part depreciatory press comments on his retirement, according to him written without the slightest sign of sympathy for the man or even any comprehension that there may be a human tragedy in the background. The King and Queen drove down from Windsor to visit the dying man on October 14. Chamberlain received hundreds of sympathetic letters from friends and supporters. He wrote to John Simon, who had served as Chancellor of the Exchequer in Chamberlain's government. T was the hope of doing something to improve the conditions of life for the poorer people that brought me at past middle life into politics, and it is some satisfaction to me that I was able to carry out some part of my ambition even though its permanency may be challenged by the destruction of war. For the rest I regret nothing that I have done and I can see nothing undone that I ought to have done. I am therefore content to accept the fate that has so suddenly overtaken me. Death. Chamberlain died of bowel cancer on November 9, 1940 at the age of 71. A funeral service took place at Westminster Abbey 5 days later on Thursday, November 14. However, due to wartime security concerns, the date and time were not widely publicized. Chamberlain's former private secretary John Colville functioned as the service's usher, whilst both Winston Churchill and Lord Halifax acted as pallbearers. After cremation, his ashes were interred in the Abbey next to those of Bonner Law. Churchill eulogized Chamberlain in the House of Commons 3 days after his death. Whatever else history may or may not say about these terrible, tremendous years, we can be sure that Neville Chamberlain acted with perfect sincerity according to his lights and strove to the utmost of his capacity and authority, which were powerful, to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged. This alone will stand him in good stead as far as what is called the verdict of history is concerned. Although some Chamberlain supporters found Churchill's oratory to be faint praise of the late Prime Minister, Churchill added less publicly, "Whatever shall I do without poor Neville? I was relying on him to look after the home front for me." Amongst others who paid tribute to Chamberlain in the Commons and in the House of Lords on November 12, 1940 were Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, and the Liberal Party leader and Air Minister, Sir Archibald Sinclair. David Lloyd George, the only former Prime Minister remaining in the Commons, had been expected to speak, but absented himself from the proceedings. Ever close to his family, the executors of Chamberlain's will were his cousins, Wilfred Byng Kenrick and Sir Wilfrid Martineau, both of whom, like Chamberlain, were Lord Mayors of Birmingham. Legacy and reputation. A few days before his death, Neville Chamberlain wrote, "So far as my personal reputation is concerned, I am not in the least disturbed about it. The letters which I am still receiving in such vast quantities so unanimously dwell on the same point, namely, without Munich the war would have been lost and the Empire destroyed in 1938. I do not feel the opposite view has a chance of survival. Even if nothing further were to be published giving the true inside story of the past 2 years, I should not fear the historian's verdict. Guilty Men was not the only Second World War tract that damaged Chamberlain's reputation. We Were Not All Wrong, published in 1941, took a similar tack to Guilty Men, arguing that Liberal and Labour MPs, and a small number of Conservatives, had fought against Chamberlain's appeasement policies. The author, Liberal MP Geoffrey Mander, had voted against conscription in 1939. Another polemic against Conservative policies was Why Not Trust the Tories, which castigated the Conservatives for the foreign policy decisions of Baldwin and Chamberlain. Though a few Conservatives offered their own versions of events, most notably MP Quintin Hogg in his 1945 "The Left Was Never Right," by the end of the war, there was a very strong public belief that Chamberlain was culpable for serious diplomatic and military misjudgments that had nearly caused Britain's defeat. Chamberlain's reputation was devastated by these attacks from the left. In 1948, with the publication of The Gathering Storm, the first volume of Churchill's 6-volume set, The Second World War, Chamberlain sustained an even more serious assault from the right. While Churchill stated privately, "This is not history, this is my case," his series was still hugely influential. Churchill depicted Chamberlain as well-meaning but weak, blind to the threat posed by Hitler, and oblivious to the fact that Hitler could have been removed from power by a grand coalition of European states. Churchill suggested that the year's delay between Munich and war worsened Britain's position, and criticized Chamberlain for both peacetime and wartime decisions. In the years following the publication of Churchill's books, few historians questioned his judgment. Anne Chamberlain, the former Premier's widow, suggested that Churchill's work was filled with matters that are not real misstatements that could easily be corrected, but wholesale omissions and assumptions that certain things are now recognized as facts which actually have no such position. Many of Chamberlain's family letters and his extensive personal papers were bequeathed by his family in 1974 to the Birmingham University Archives. During the war, the Chamberlain family had commissioned historian Keith Feeling to produce an official biography, and gave him access to Chamberlain's private diaries and papers. While feeling had the right of access to official papers as the official biographer of a recently deceased person, he may not have been aware of the provision, and the cabinet secretary denied his requests for access. Though feeling produced what historian David Dutton described in 2001 as the most impressive and persuasive single-volume biography of Chamberlain, he could not repair the damage already done to Chamberlain's reputation. Conservative MP Ian MacLeod's 1961 biography of Chamberlain was the first major biography of a revisionist school of thought on Chamberlain. The same year, A.J.P. Taylor, in his The Origins of the Second World War, found that Chamberlain had adequately rearmed Britain for defence and described Munich as a triumph for all that was best and most enlightened in British life, for those who had courageously denounced the harshness and short-sightedness of Versailles. The adoption of the 30-year rule in 1967 made available many of the papers of the Chamberlain government over the subsequent 3 years, helping to explain why Chamberlain acted as he did. The resultant works greatly fueled the revisionist school, although they also included books that strongly criticized Chamberlain, such as Keith Middlemas's 1972 Diplomacy of Illusion. Released papers indicated that, contrary to claims made in Guilty Men, Chamberlain had neither ignored the advice of the Foreign Office nor had he disregarded and run roughshod over his cabinet. Other released papers showed that Chamberlain had considered seeking a grand coalition amongst European governments like that later advocated by Churchill, but had rejected it on the ground that the division of Europe into two camps would make war more, not less likely. They also showed that Chamberlain had been advised that the Dominions, pursuing independent foreign policies under the Statute of Westminster, had indicated that Chamberlain could not depend on their help in the event of a continental war. The Chiefs of Staff report, which indicated that Britain could not forcibly prevent Germany from conquering Czechoslovakia, was first publicly known at this time. In reaction to the revisionist school of thought regarding Chamberlain, a post-revisionist school emerged beginning in the 1990s, using the released papers to justify the initial conclusions of Guilty Men. Oxford historian R.A.C. Parker argued that Chamberlain could have forged a close alliance with France after the Anschluss, in early 1938, and begun a policy of containment of Germany under the auspices of the League of Nations. While many revisionist writers had suggested that Chamberlain had had few or no choices in his actions, Parker argued that Chamberlain and his colleagues had chosen appeasement over other viable policies. In his 2 volumes, Chamberlain, An Appeasement and Churchill, An Appeasement, Parker stated that Chamberlain, due to his powerful, obstinate personality and his skill in debate, caused Britain to embrace appeasement instead of effective deterrence. Parker also suggested that had Churchill held high office in the second half of the 1930s, Churchill would have built a series of alliances which would have deterred Hitler, and perhaps would have caused Hitler's domestic opponents to procure his removal. In 2020, British historian Alan Allport concluded Neville Chamberlain was vain, mean, casually bigoted, boring, ungrateful, spiteful, obstinate and friendless. Egotistical but also insecure and thin-skinned, he cultivated close relations with the Fleet Street barons and lobby correspondents and gloried in favourable newspaper reports about himself, yet complained bitterly that the press was always attacking him. Dutton observes that Chamberlain's reputation, for good or ill, will probably always be closely tied to evaluation of his policy toward Germany. Whatever else may be said of Chamberlain's public life, his reputation will in the last resort depend upon assessments of this moment and this policy. This was the case when he left office in 1940, and it remains so 60 years later. To expect otherwise is rather like hoping that Pontius Pilate will one day be judged as a successful provincial administrator of the Roman Empire. Honours. Academic Honours. Fellow of the Royal Society 1938. Oxford University DCL. University of Cambridge LLD. Birmingham University LLD. Bristol University LLD, Leeds University LLD, Reading University DLit. Freedoms. Honorary Freedom City of Birmingham. Honorary Freedom City of London conferred 1940 but died before acceptance, the scroll being presented to his widow in 1941. Honorary Military Appointments. 1939, Honorary Air Commodore, No. 916 Balloon Squadron, Auxiliary Air Force. Parliamentary election results.